You probably think you know the answer to the question of which country in the world is richest, but you may be surprised at the true answer. We also consider the critical question of whether living in one of these rich countries necessarily means a better standard of living for the average person. This video is sponsored by Emma Sleep, the award-winning maker of premium mattresses and sleep products. So let's look at the richest country in the world in a bit more detail. Let's start off with a controversial statement. America's a rich country, Britain is a poor country with one wealthy region. But that begs the question, what do we mean by rich? Well, one measure might be wealth. So this is the stock of the total value of all assets, minus the liabilities. So roughly that's the stuff you own minus the debts that you owe. Alternatively, we might consider income. Now that's a flow measure. In other words, it's the rate of change of wealth over time. It's how much new money is flowing through the door. And often if you compare countries based on the stock of wealth versus the flow of income, you get very different answers. And we will look at both. Now, if we're thinking about an aggregate for an entire country, we'd consider gross domestic product. This is the total value of all the goods and services produced by a country over the space of a year. And this is, of course, a flow measure. And another thing we'll consider is GDP per capita. We take the total GDP for a country and we divide by the number of people in that country. And both of those are flow measures. So here's the answer you probably thought you knew already, which is that the US is by far the richest country in the world. And this is by comparing GDP. So the total GDP of the US is about $27 trillion. China's in a fairly distant second place, and its GDP is about $17.7 trillion. And then we fall a long way to the also-rans, countries like Germany, Japan, and so on. Notably, the UK now comes in at number 6 behind India, according to this measure. Now, this data comes from the IMF, which has a database of all of these GDP values and variants of them. If we sort by value, you can see that the US is top, and then we've got all the other countries. What you can also do is move this slider around to see what the GDP was in the past. So if we go back to 1980, say, you can see that the big GDP generators were the US, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK. China was at a very distant 7th place in 1980. But then notice as we slide time forwards, China very rapidly moved up in the 1990s. India also is now moving up the table very rapidly. Now you might be thinking, well, the cost of living is very different if you're in India, say, or in the United States. So what really matters is the purchasing power of your income based on the cost of buying stuff in your country. And that stuff would be goods and services. So a very common way of adjusting for the buying power of your money is to look at purchasing power parity. There's a standardized basket of goods and services which can be compared across the world. And now what we can do is compare GDP based on PPP. And this changes the picture entirely. Now China is way out in the lead in terms of GDP, presumably because the cost of living in China is considerably less than the United States. India now moves into 3rd place. Then we've got Japan, Germany, the Russian Federation, and Indonesia and Brazil are ahead of the UK, which is now pushed into 9th place. Another way we can look at it is based on GDP per capita, because some countries have lots of people and we have to adjust for that, because GDP is just the amount of goods and services produced per person multiplied by the number of people. So if we're looking at wealth per person, that would be GDP per capita. Now what we see is that the dominance of the largest countries is very much broken, and a lot of very small countries like Luxembourg are pushed to the top of the table because they're very productive. We'll look at the reasons behind some of these countries being so high up the table in a moment, but you can see that Luxembourg, Ireland, Switzerland, Norway, which weren't even on the previous map, are now very much at the top of the table. The US is now number 7 and the UK isn't even in the top 10. In fact, to find the UK, you now have to go all the way down to number 23 in the table. So here we are. Here's the UK. So why are some of these very small countries so productive? Why do they produce so many goods and services per person? Well, at the top of the table, we've got tax havens. So that would include Luxembourg and Ireland. By having favourable tax rates, these countries attract a lot of investment. So capital's passing through those countries, usually through financial products. For example, if you're based in the UK and you've got an ETF, it's very likely that it's going to be domiciled in Ireland or possibly Luxembourg. Another set of countries which do very well are the ones which are lucky enough to be sitting on mineral deposits or energy deposits in the form of fossil fuels. So that would include Norway, Qatar, but also Australia, which sells a lot of commodities to China and other countries, and also Iceland, which has lots of geothermal energy. Another thing which pushes up a country's productivity is offering a lot of financial services internationally. So this would include Luxembourg, but also Switzerland and Singapore. Singapore's also pushed up by the fact that it has a lot of transit trade. It sits as a hub, a transport hub, between the Far East and the West. And of course, it also has huge chip manufacturing capabilities. And then the final country, which is a bit of a surprise, is Denmark, which doesn't really sit on any mineral deposits of note or have anything else going in its favour other than it seems to distribute its wealth quite evenly amongst its population. So the GDP per capita looks pretty good. Maybe there's a lesson in there for other countries. I make a lot of content for YouTube and for our membership, and I always have to be in a good state of mind to be creative. So getting enough good quality sleep is very important to me. Since we've had an Emma mattress, I'm much more comfortable in bed and I'm getting much better quality sleep. So here's what I like about our new mattress. Firstly, it came vacuum packed inside a cardboard box. You might have heard people talking about Emma as a mattress in a box. But what this meant practically is that it actually fit through our front door. Furthermore, when we put it on our bed, it expanded, which was quite exciting. Secondly, you can adjust the mattress by buying something called a flip topper, and this sits on top of your mattress. By flipping it, you can adjust your mattress to be either firmer or softer according to your preference. And I love this flexibility and modularity of design. Thirdly, it's not hot. The top layer of the mattress is made of something called ergo-cell foam. And this is a memory foam which adapts to the shape of your body. However, it's open-pored, and that means that it conducts moisture away from your body, but also excess heat. In fact, the only member of our household who's not delighted with our new mattress is Teddy, who's not allowed on the bed. Now, as always, investment is about risk-adjusted return. And in this case, Emma Sleep has de-risked the purchase by offering a 200-night risk-free trial. And they also offer a 10-year guarantee with every mattress that they sell. They also offer free delivery and returns if you're not happy with their products. Now, don't miss out on the huge Emma Sleep Black Friday sale with up to 55% off and an additional 10% off if you use my promo code, which is PensionCraftBF. And that's available to people in the United Kingdom, Ireland, but also the United States. To claim that discount, just click on the link in the description below and let them know. Another consideration when we look at wealth is, should we look at the mean wealth or the median wealth? Because the answer can be very different. To illustrate that, let's consider a really tiny country with just 5 people in it. And let's say the wealth of those people is distributed, as you can see beside me. 4 people in the country have wealth of around 100,000, 120,000, at most 150,000. But one person is a multimillionaire. They've got 10 million. Now, if we look at the typical wealth in that country according to the mean, or the average, we just add up all of those numbers and divide by the number of people. So the mean person in that country, the average person, would have a wealth of 2.1 million. So we might think, well, this is a country of millionaires. However, if we look at the median, which is much less sensitive to those outliers, really rich people, to calculate that, we just line up all the people and choose the person's wealth in the middle, which in this case is going to be about $130,000. So according to the median as a measure of typical, the typical person in this society is not a millionaire. And I think this is much more realistic if we're comparing distributions where we have some really big values. The median just ignores those crazy high values and it's not affected by them. Whereas the average, the mean, is affected by them. So if we look at the UBS 2023 wealth report and look at the mean wealth, that's the average wealth per person in each country, then you can see countries like Switzerland, the United States, Hong Kong, Australia, Denmark, New Zealand all come out very high in this table. And this is of course wealth that we're looking at. It's the stock of assets minus liabilities. The UK on this measure doesn't come out very well at all. It comes out at number 13 on the table. But now let's switch to median wealth. Remember, this isn't as sensitive to outliers. I think it's a better measure of the typical wealth of people in a country. Well, because of the uneven distribution of wealth in the United States, it moves way down the table from number 2 down to number 13. And interestingly, a country like the UK moves up the table from number 13 to number 7. And countries like Belgium, Australia, Hong Kong, and New Zealand are at the top of the table. So if you're an average person living in one of these countries, you probably would be more interested in looking at the median wealth rather than the mean. What's also interesting is to compare subnational wealth, in other words, regional wealth within a country, because some countries are also skewed by very rich capitals. And if you remember the statement we started out with, which is that America's a rich country and that Britain's a poor country with one rich region, this was a statement made by John Byrne Murdoch. So he's a columnist for the Financial Times and he's a visual data journalist. His title is he's chief data reporter for the FT, and he comes up with some amazing graphs. And regular viewers will know I'm very keen on graphs. And as he says in this tweet, people like to compare the UK to Mississippi, which is the poorest state in the US. But he makes the point that it's also interesting to look at the UK subnationally, broken down by region. So that's what he's doing here. We're comparing the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and the US according to wealth by city, but also some regions. And this is GDP per capita, and it's that PPP measure, which is cost of living adjusted. Now, if we focus on the UK, notice that there's one region that really stands out, and that's London. Its GDP per capita is well above any other region or city in the UK. Edinburgh is the closest, and that's a very distant second. Now, the horizontal blue line you can see is the national average for each of these countries. And the horizontal red line is the national average if you strip out the richest city. Now in the UK, that drops the GDP per capita by 14%. Furthermore, if you extrapolate the UK GDP per capita, stripping out London, you can see that indeed that is equal to the GDP per capita for Mississippi. So a country where all of the wealth is focused on one city is described as being monopolar. Other European countries aren't quite as monopolar as the UK. Germany, for example, you could strip out Munich, the richest city, and it doesn't make a huge difference to its average wealth. The Netherlands has a slightly more monopolar wealth distribution. If you take out Amsterdam, then it does reduce the national wealth, but it is much closer to states which are quite wealthy in the United States, like Florida or Texas. And John Byrne Murdoch makes the point that if you strip out the Bay Area, that's between Golden Gate to the north and Cupertino in the south, US GDP per capita would only fall by 4%. So why is the UK so dependent on just one region? Well, it's long been the case that London has been disproportionately rich relative to the rest of the country. But rather than that equalising, what we've seen since the pandemic is that London's continued growing faster than the rest of the country. In fact, it's the only UK region which has grown continuously since the pandemic. If we add other European countries, some of them are quite monopolar, like France, for example. If we take out Paris, then its GDP moves down a lot, but Lyon isn't too far behind Paris. In Spain and Italy, Madrid and Milan also punch above their weights. They tend to be very wealthy relative to the rest of the country, but it's still the UK which really stands out as being monopolar. So for some people, they'll be watching this and thinking, my country's rich, why aren't I? And again, we can use some beautiful data from John Byrne Murdoch. And here he's making the point that the US and the UK are poor societies overall, but both of them have some very rich people which push up averages. So what he does here is to rank the income of households from the very poorest households to the very wealthiest. And then each of the lines that you can see on these graphs shows you how the wealth has changed over time for each different country in this sample of countries. So if we focus on just the very poorest households by income, so this is the 5th percentile and the 10th percentile where 90% of household incomes are higher, notice that Switzerland and Norway still have a pretty good standard of living when we compare against other countries, whereas the UK and Slovenia are below the developed country average. So the key point here is that the Brits and Americans in the bottom 10% of the income percentiles have a far lower standard of living than the poor in other countries, and below that of the average developed country. Another way of looking at that is the top 10% income versus the bottom 10%. Now in a typical developed country, that ratio is 3 times. For the UK, it's 5 times, and for the US, it's 6 times. So as John Byrne Murdoch puts it, the poorest in the US and the UK are scraping by, with living standards that the poor in much less wealthy countries would consider rough. So if you're one of the typical people, one of the poor, living in one of these countries which are rich, you'd probably choose to live in one of the countries where the distribution of wealth is more equitable. So that would be the French, the Dutch, Austrians, or Germans. In those countries, the standard of living ranks among the best, whether you're rich or poor. So there we are, quite a nuanced answer according to the question you ask. Do you PPP adjust your income? Do you look at regional variations? Do you look at the mean or the median wealth? And I think because it's nuanced, it's a more interesting answer. Now don't forget our offer from Emma Sleep. You get a discount of up to 65% off your purchases. You just use our promotional code, which is PensionCraftBF, or use the link in the description below. And I genuinely would have no hesitation recommending them. I have actually slept on the mattress for a while now, and it is more comfortable. And, as always, thank you for listening.